Okay, there is something called heuristic shortcuts. So the way that the brain works, the reason why we're able to do the amazing things our brain does, so heuristics are models. So for example, we have this map, this ability in our brain to memorize faces. Many of us are not so, like me, are not so good with names. I keep forgetting names, but you always feel like you know a face. And the brain is very good at looking at all the characteristics of a face and then mapping them as a pattern. And then does pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is that's what allows us to make quick decisions. And very often our quick decisions are right. But sometimes our quick decisions are wrong. And the quick decisions are all shaped by this pattern making quality. So if we understand these built-in patterns or these learned patterns, either one, will often always make the same decision because it's using the same algorithm shortcut methodology. It's using the same instant multivariable calculation. So we need to understand those because those lead to how people make quick decisions. It's a very important part of how we work. So altruism, I mentioned altruism before. So the classical theory is that people are what are called self-regarding. They consider themselves most important, and they're always trying to maximize self-value. We mentioned this is the third retreat so far in the series. The second retreat, which was on creating green jobs and the energy efficiency economy that we just had 2-3 weeks ago. What we learned is there are all these amazing energy efficiency programs throughout the country, and they're not being used. Very, very low uptake rates. And there are a lot of questions why, but what we learned is that when all you say to somebody is, I'm going to save you $800 a year or $1,200 a year if you green your house, it turns out the dollars are not a very high motivator. David's going to talk about some other messaging, which is a more social, positive, different kind of message, which turns out it creates much, much higher uptake rates than the dollar messaging. It doesn't mean, by the way, this is not to say that dollars don't matter. They certainly do. And certainly businesses are organized to make dollar-based decisions. By the way, one thing that's really, really important, a lesson of all this is there's no pure answer. It's not this or that, it's both. And so when I am focusing on these issues, I am not undermining the power of economics or the fact that we have to pay for green improvements. What I'm trying to say, though, is that they're highly influenced by these other factors. So it turns out that altruism is we're very high wired for it. It's a very high motivator. And I'll give you an example. In Switzerland, for many years, Switzerland's the home of the Red Cross. So the idea of donating blood is a very strong part of the Swiss culture. They noticed about 30 years ago that donations were going down. Fewer and fewer people were donating. So they came up with this idea that they would start paying people for donations because classical economic theory says that's how you get more participation. And as soon as they did that, donations crashed. And the reason was people were donating because of the WeMap. And the altruism, the do good for the world. And as soon as you said, I'm going to pay you $10 for a blood donation, people go, I'm going to have them stick a needle in my arm and waste a half hour and go through all this stuff for $10. It's not worth it. When you put in the economic value, it put it into the MEMAP mine and it failed. So they had to stop paying for it and figure out how to create the stronger altruistic model, which proved to be a bigger motivator. Another example, academic journals. People are to be on a peer review committee of one of the top academic journals is a big honor. It's a very important thing. I don't know if you know, in the science community, a lot of the academic journals have been taken over by for-profit companies, and a few started offering to pay people $50 an article to peer review. And immediately they started assigning all those articles to their grad students and not doing the work themselves. Because for $50, the whole $50 was a low status payment. Being on the editorial committee was a high status job, and it reframed it in a negative way for them. So altruism is a very, very important motivator, and group selection. So the other thing is we are evolved to make distinctions between groups. So for example, we're going to hear from CRED tomorrow, the Center for Research and Environmental Decision Making. One of the very interesting studies is that if you send a letter to people, ask them to recycle from a town, and then send the exact same letter from a county, same letterhead, same typeface, you'll get 3 times the recycling rate if it comes from the town. Because people have a much stronger association with their town. People tend to have a very weak, very few people go, I'm a real proud member of my county. And so this group selection, we actually are evolved to have a sense of in and out, or of who we're part of and who we're not of, and we need to use that. So fairness, I talked to you about the fairness thing in the ultimative game, and we're very wired for fairness, and people are of all cultures are deeply motivated to try and create an environment or place that's more fair. Time inconsistency and hyperbolic discounting. Okay, so in the economic theory about present value and creating discount values, any of us who are doing pro formas about buying buildings or making investments know the rationality of kind of looking at a 7 or 10 year payback and how that goes against discounted cash flow, et cetera. But human beings don't do that. Our human computer doesn't do that. Hyperbolic means that we way accentuate. We really want to see things now, and we really low value things way off in the future. So asking people to make rational decisions, again, this one to green your home, which may have very good long-term value, but if it's not going to pay off near term, we are very unlikely to make that decision. So we need to find new ways to frame things to get over this hyperbaric discounting. The status quo bias. So status quo bias has to do with a thing, for example, I mentioned with the driver's license, where we really love just to leave things the way they are. So very interesting. I was part of this meeting that Rockefeller Foundation called together with all these behavioral economists, and they were given a problem. And the problem was to the Energy Star thermostat, I'm sorry, the programmable thermostat had been taken off the Energy Star list. And it was called non-green for a simple reason that nobody used it. And their theory was, if nobody's going to use it, it's not producing any quantifiable results in the field. And these economists, by the way, there were Nobel Prize winners in the room, literally spent 6 hours on this problem. And it was really, we were just starting this program, and it was a major impetus for why you're here. Because not one of them ever ran a building, had real tenants, had to really deal with the thermostat, as far as I could tell. And so it was all complete theory. It was completely irrelevant, the stuff that they were coming up with. The goal of this project, by the way, is to connect theory with action. So I had a revelation in the middle of that meeting. John was encouraging us to take quiet time and develop revelations, and mine was status quo bias. So if you program a thermostat with the green setting and people are lazy or people status quo won't touch it, then it'll always be green. So some of us know the head of the Home Depot Foundation, so I called her up and proposed this idea. And she said, that makes a lot of sense. And it turns out that Home Depot thermostats are programmed with a pre-programming. That is, I actually have they recently sent me the setting. And the theory is that if you don't bother to set the thermostat, it's always going to be doing the right thing. And as we know, only 4 or 6% of people are actually going to bother to set it. And so the status quo bias can actually be used in our, for our benefit.